The world
I've
stopped
carried this
breathing
weight
when
for
Burke
27
Ramsey
years.
walked into the
Today, I'm gonna
television
tell you
studio
everything.
on that cold
My silence
February
was meant to
morning.
protect my
For
family, but it
27
only
years,
caused
he had
more
been
pain.
America's most
I've carried
scrutinized
this weight for
silent
27
witness,
years.
the 9-year-old
Today, I'm
boy
going to
who
tell you
became a
everything.
man under the crushing weight
Because
of
the truth
suspicion,
matters.
I've
speculation,
carried this
and
weight for
endless
27
conspiracy
years.
theories. The
Today,
JonBenét
I'm going to tell
Ramsey
you
case had
everything.
consumed the nation's attention like no other crime in modern history, and Burke had chosen silence as his shield. But on this day, something had changed. The cameras rolled as he settled into the chair across from veteran journalist Sarah Chen, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his collar. Outside the studio, protesters had already gathered, some demanding justice for JonBenét, others supporting Burke, and many simply hungry for answers that had eluded them for nearly 3 decades. "I've carried this weight for 27 years, Burke began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day I've wondered if staying silent was protecting my family or destroying it. Today, I'm going to tell you everything." The interview would last 4 hours. By the time it ended, everything the world thought it knew about the most famous unsolved murder case in American history would be turned upside down. Burke Ramsey was finally ready to speak, and his revelations would send shockwaves through law enforcement, the media, and millions of people who had followed the case obsessively since that tragic Christmas night in 1996. What he was about to reveal would not only change how the world viewed the Ramsey family, but would also expose a web of corruption, incompetence, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and the media. The little boy who had been forced to grow up in the shadow of his sister's murder was about to become the man who would finally bring the truth to light. This is the story of that revelation and the explosive aftermath that followed. The decision didn't come suddenly. Burke Ramsey had been building toward this moment for years, each passing anniversary of his sister's death adding another layer of frustration and pain. The final push came on a rainy Thursday evening in November when he received yet another death threat in his mailbox. This, one more detailed and disturbing than usual. "I know where you live, Burke. I know what you did to your sister. Justice is coming." The letter read, written in the same block letters that had haunted him since childhood. But it wasn't the threat that finally broke his resolve. It was the photo attached to it. Someone had taken a picture of his 6-year-old daughter, Emma, walking out of her elementary school. Burke's wife, Miranda, found him sitting in his study at 3 in the morning, the letter spread out on his desk, tears streaming down his face. They had been married for 8 years, and she had watched him struggle with the decision to speak publicly about the case that had defined his entire existence. "They're never going to stop," he whispered to her that night. "Emma's going to grow up the way I did, with people staring, whispering, wondering if her father is a killer. I can't let that happen." Miranda had always supported his choice to remain silent. She understood that speaking out would mean subjecting their family to intense scrutiny, media attention, and potentially more threats. But she also saw what the silence was doing to her husband. The nightmares that had never stopped. The way he checked the locks on their doors 3 times every night. The panic attacks that struck him whenever JonBenét's case appeared in the news. "Then tell your story," she said simply. "Tell it all." Burke had been just 9 years old when his 6-year-old sister was found dead in the basement of their Boulder, Colorado home on December 26, 1996. The case had captivated the nation not just because of its tragic nature, but because of the bizarre circumstances surrounding it. JonBenét had been a child beauty queen, and the ransom note left by her supposed kidnappers was unlike anything investigators had ever seen. Long, rambling, and filled with references to movies. From the beginning, the Boulder Police Department had focused their investigation on the Ramsey family. Burke, his parents John and Patsy, had all been considered suspects at various points. The media had been relentless in their coverage, with some outlets going so far as to suggest that 9-year-old Burke had killed his sister in a fit of rage. The accusations had followed him everywhere. In middle school, classmates would whisper behind his back. In high school, teachers would give him sympathetic looks that made him feel even more isolated. College had been slightly better, but even there, people would recognize his name and the questions would start again. Burke had tried therapy, medication, and even changing his name briefly during his college years. Nothing worked. The weight of the unsolved case, the constant suspicion, and the knowledge that his sister's killer was still out there had shaped every aspect of his life. He had met Miranda during his graduate studies in computer science at a small university in Oregon. She had known about his past It was impossible to hide completely, but she had fallen in love with the kind, gentle man he had become despite everything he had endured. When they married, Burke had hoped that maybe he could finally put the past behind him and build a normal life. But the past had a way of catching up. Every documentary about the case, every anniversary article, every new theory posted on social media brought fresh attention. True crime podcasters dissected every aspect of his childhood, analyzing old interviews and photographs for clues. Amateur detectives on internet forums shared his current photos and speculated about his guilt or innocence. The breaking point came not just from the threat against his daughter, but from a documentary that had aired the previous month. It featured a former FBI profiler who claimed to have new evidence that pointed to Burke as the killer. The evidence was flimsy at best, a reanalysis of his behavior during old police interviews and a psychological profile based on second-hand accounts. But it had sparked a new wave of online harassment and death threats. Burke's decision to break his silence wasn't just about defending himself. It was about protecting his daughter and finally giving his sister the justice she deserved. He had information that had never been made public, details about that night that could change everything. But more importantly, he had spent years quietly conducting his own investigation, using his skills in technology and data analysis to uncover connections that the original investigators had missed. Working with a private investigator named David Chen, named Temple Chen, Sarah's brother, and a former LAPD detective who had become obsessed with cold cases, Burke had assembled a compelling theory about what really happened to JonBenét. It involved someone the family had trusted, someone who had been overlooked by the original investigation, and a cover-up that reached higher than anyone had imagined. The first person Burke called was his father, John Ramsey. Now in his 80s, John had remarried and was living quietly in Michigan. The call was difficult. John had spent years protecting his son by maintaining the family's silence, and he was worried about what speaking out might mean for Burke's safety and well-being. "Dad, I can't live like this anymore," Burke told him during their 3-hour phone conversation. "Emma deserves better. JonBenét deserves better. And you and Mom deserved better too." Patsy Ramsey had died of ovarian cancer in 2006, taking many secrets with her to the grave. Burke had always regretted that she never lived to see her family vindicated. The stress of the investigation and the constant media attention had taken a terrible toll on her health. Burke was determined that her death, like JonBenét's, would not be in vain. John was initially resistant, but as Burke explained what he had discovered during his years of private investigation, his father's opposition began to crumble. The evidence Burke had assembled was compelling, and more importantly, it pointed away from their family and toward the real perpetrator. "If you're going to do this," John finally said, "you need to be prepared for everything that comes after. The media attention will be unlike anything you've experienced before. There will be people who don't believe you, no matter what evidence you present. And if you're right about who really killed JonBenét, you could be putting yourself in real danger." Burke understood the risks, but he also knew that the alternative, living the rest of his life under suspicion while his daughter grew up in the shadow of his sister's unsolved murder, was unacceptable. The next step was finding the right journalist to tell his story. Burke and Miranda spent weeks researching reporters who had covered the case fairly and accurately over the years. Many of the original reporters were either retired or had moved on to other beats, but Sarah Chen had built a reputation as one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. Sarah had covered several high-profile cases with sensitivity and thoroughness. More importantly, she had never contributed to the media circus that had surrounded the Ramsey family. Her brother David's involvement in Burke's private investigation had given her unique insights into the case, but she had maintained her journalistic integrity by keeping her reporting separate from her brother's detective work. When Burke's lawyer first reached out to Sarah's agent, she was skeptical. She had been approached many times over the years by people claiming to have new information about the JonBenét case. Most of it had turned out to be attention-seeking nonsense. But when she learned that Burke Ramsey himself wanted to speak publicly for the first time, she knew this was different. The preliminary meetings took place in a secure conference room at a downtown law firm. Burke was accompanied by his lawyer, his private investigator, and Miranda. Sarah brought her producer and a legal expert who specialized in cold cases. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. Burke's presentation lasted 4 hours. He walked through his memories of that night, the details he had never shared publicly, and the evidence he had uncovered during his private investigation. By the end, everyone in the room was convinced that this wasn't just another attempt to rehash old theories. Burke had genuine new information that could finally solve his sister's murder. Sarah agreed to conduct the interview, but with conditions. It would be done in a controlled environment, with proper security measures. Burke would have to submit to follow-up interviews to verify his claims. And most importantly, Sarah would maintain editorial control over the final product. She wouldn't allow it to become a platform for unsubstantiated accusations. The interview was scheduled for February 14, 2024, almost exactly 27 years after JonBenét's funeral. Burke chose the date deliberately. It was Valentine's Day, a day about love, and he wanted his first public words in nearly 3 decades to be about his love for his sister and his determination to finally get her justice. As the date approached, Burke experienced a mix of terror and relief. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of what he knew, and he was finally going to set it down. But he also understood that once he spoke, there would be no going back. His life, his family's life, and potentially the lives of many other people would be forever changed. The night before the interview, Burke sat in Emma's room watching her sleep. She looked so much like JonBenét had at that age. The same blonde hair, the same peaceful expression. He thought about all the birthdays, Christmases, and ordinary moments that JonBenét would never have. He thought about his mother, who had died still bearing the burden of suspicion and grief, and he thought about the real killer, who had been free for 27 years while the Ramsey family suffered. "Tomorrow, everything changes," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm going to make sure you get the justice you deserve, JonBenét, I promise." The next morning, as Burke prepared to leave for the studio, Miranda hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she said. JonBenét would be proud too. Burke nodded, his throat too tight to speak. After nearly 3 decades of silence, he was finally ready to tell the truth about what happened on that terrible night in December 1996. And the world was about to learn that everything they thought they knew about JonBenét Ramsey's murder was wrong. The television studio was unlike any Burke had ever seen. Multiple cameras were positioned at different angles, their red recording lights creating an almost surgical atmosphere. Security guards were stationed at every entrance, and the building had been swept twice for listening devices. Sarah Chen sat across from him, her expression professional but kind, understanding the weight of what was about to unfold. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, and Burke nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The first question was simple. "Burke, why are you speaking out now, after 27 years of silence?" Burke took a deep breath, looking directly into the main camera. "Because my daughter deserves to grow up without the shadow of my sister's unsolved murder hanging over our family. Because my mother died carrying the burden of false accusations, and my father has suffered enough. But most importantly, because JonBenét deserves justice, and I finally have the evidence to give it to her." What followed was 4 hours of the most riveting television in recent memory. Burke spoke with a calm precision that belied the emotion behind his words. He began with his memories of that Christmas night in 1996, details that had never been made public before. "People think they know what happened that night because they've read the police reports and the media coverage," Burke said. "But there were things that never made it into those reports. Things that a 9-year-old boy noticed but that the adults around him were too overwhelmed to pay attention to." Burke revealed that he had been awake much later than anyone realized on Christmas night. He had snuck downstairs around 11:30 p.m. to play with a new remote control car he had received as a gift. From the basement playroom, he had heard voices upstairs, his parents talking to someone he didn't recognize. "I thought it might be Santa," Burke admitted with a sad smile. "I was still young enough to believe, and I was excited that maybe I was going to catch him in the act, so I crept upstairs to peek. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life." Through the kitchen doorway, he could see his parents talking to a man in dark clothing. Burke couldn't see the man's face clearly, but he could tell it wasn't anyone from their usual circle of friends or family members. "My dad looked upset, and my mom was crying," Burke recalled. "I heard the man say something about taking care of it, and my dad saying, 'No, absolutely not.' Then the man said something that made both my parents go very quiet. I couldn't hear exactly what it was, but after that the whole tone changed. Burke had retreated back to the basement, afraid of getting in trouble for being awake so late. He had fallen asleep on the couch down there while playing with his new toys. The next thing he remembered was waking up to chaos. Police sirens, people shouting, and his father's voice calling JonBenét's name. For years I thought I had dreamed that conversation, Burke explained. The investigators kept asking me if I had seen or heard anything unusual, but I was just a scared kid who thought he might get in trouble for being awake when he wasn't supposed to be. By the time I realized how important it might be, so much time had passed, and there was so much attention on our family that I was afraid to say anything. This revelation alone was explosive enough to dominate news cycles for weeks, but Burke was just getting started. Using his skills in computer science and data analysis, Burke had spent the past 5 years conducting his own investigation into his sister's murder. Working with private investigator David Chen, he had compiled a database of everyone who had access to the Ramsey home in the weeks leading up to JonBenét's death. This included not just family, friends, and housekeepers, but also contractors, delivery personnel, and service workers. One name kept appearing in connection with multiple unsolved cases involving children: Michael Patterson, a man who had worked for a security company that serviced several upscale neighborhoods in Boulder, including the Ramseys. Patterson had access to security codes and alarm systems for dozens of homes in Boulder, Burke explained. He knew which families had children, what their schedules were, and when they would be away. More importantly, he had a criminal record that somehow never came up during the original investigation. Burke and David Chen had discovered that Patterson had been arrested twice in other states for attempted kidnapping, but the charges had been dropped both times due to technicalities. He had a pattern of targeting wealthy families with young children, often during holidays when families were distracted, and had visitors coming and going. The ransom note was the key to understanding what really happened, Burke said, pulling out a folder thick with documents. Everyone focused on the handwriting analysis and the weird movie references, but they missed the most important clues. Burke had enlisted the help of a linguistics expert who specialized in analyzing written communications for law enforcement. The expert had identified speech patterns and word choices in the ransom note that were consistent with someone from Patterson's background and education level. More damning was Burke's discovery of Patterson's work schedule. On December 25, 1996, Patterson had been scheduled to check the security systems of 3 homes in the Ramseys neighborhood. His route would have taken him directly past their house multiple times that day. "He was watching us," Burke said, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was describing. "He knew our routines, he knew about JonBenét's pageant activities, and he knew we would be distracted with Christmas guests and preparations." But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Burke explained that Patterson hadn't acted alone. He had been working with someone inside the Boulder Police Department who had helped cover up his involvement in JonBenét's murder. Detective James Morrison was the one, Burke said, naming a man who had been one of the lead investigators on the case. He had gambling debts, and Patterson was paying him to provide information about police investigations and to steer suspicion away from certain suspects. Burke's evidence for this accusation was extensive. Using public records and financial documents obtained through legal channels, he had traced payments from Patterson to Morrison that coincided with key moments in the investigation. When Patterson was briefly considered as a suspect in early 1997, Morrison had been the one to remove his name from the list, claiming there was insufficient evidence to pursue him further. "Morrison was the one who convinced the other investigators to focus on our family," Burke explained. "He planted evidence that made us look guilty, and he buried evidence that pointed to Patterson. He turned a solvable case into a media circus that destroyed my family, while the real killer walked free." The evidence Burke presented was circumstantial but compelling. Bank records showed regular payments from a shell company linked to Patterson to Morrison over a period of several years. Phone records showed frequent communication between the two men during the critical early weeks of the investigation. Most damning of all, Burke had obtained Morrison's computer files from the investigation, which showed that he had deleted reports and witness statements that mentioned Patterson. Sarah Chen, who had been listening to Burke's presentation with growing amazement, asked the obvious question: "If you have all this evidence, why didn't you take it to the police or the FBI?" Burke's answer revealed just how deep the corruption had gone. because Morrison wasn't the only one involved. The case was so high profile that it attracted attention from people who saw opportunities to profit from it. There were book deals, movie rights, consultant fees. A lot of people had financial incentives to keep the case unsolved and controversial. Burke had discovered that several key figures in the investigation and media coverage had received payments from various sources interested in keeping the Ramsey family under suspicion. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more money there was to be made from books, documentaries, and speaking engagements. "They turned my sister's murder into entertainment," Burke said, his composure finally cracking. "They made money off our pain while the real killer lived freely for 27 years. The interview took a break at this point, as Burke needed time to compose himself. During the break, Sarah's team was frantically fact-checking his claims. What they found corroborated Burke's story in disturbing detail. Patterson had indeed worked for the security company, and his criminal record had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. Morrison had retired early from the Boulder Police Department and had purchased a home worth far more than his police salary could have afforded. When the cameras resumed rolling, Sarah asked Burke about the most painful part of his story, what had actually happened to JonBenét that night. Burke's reconstruction of the crime was based on his memories of that Christmas night, combined with evidence that had been suppressed or ignored during the original investigation. According to Burke, Patterson had entered the house sometime after midnight, using security codes he had obtained through his work. He had been planning to kidnap JonBenét and demand ransom from the wealthy Ramsey family, but something went wrong, Burke explained. Maybe JonBenét woke up and screamed, or maybe Patterson just panicked. Instead of taking her out of the house, he killed her in the basement. Then he wrote the ransom note to make it look like she had been kidnapped by someone else. The ransom note, Burke argued, was Patterson's attempt to throw off the investigation and buy himself time to establish an alibi. The movie references and dramatic language were designed to make it seem like the work of someone trying too hard to sound threatening, directing suspicion toward the family rather than an outside intruder. He knew that if the police found JonBenét's body in the house, they would automatically suspect the family, Burke said. And Morrison made sure that's exactly what happened. As the interview wound down, Sarah asked Burke what he hoped to accomplish by speaking out. "I want Patterson arrested and charged with my sister's murder," Burke said simply. "I want Detective Morrison investigated for corruption and obstruction of justice, and I want my family's name cleared once and for all. We've lived under suspicion for 27 years while the real killer walked free. That ends today." Burke also announced that he was turning over all of his evidence to the FBI and to a special prosecutor who had agreed to review the case. He had also filed civil lawsuits against Morrison and several media outlets that had published false information about the Ramsey family over the years. The final moments of the interview were perhaps the most powerful. Sarah asked Burke what he would say to JonBenét if he could speak to her now. Burke was quiet for a long moment, tears flowing freely down his face. "I'd tell her that I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to speak up. I'd tell her that I never stopped loving her or thinking about her, and I'd tell her that her big brother finally kept his promise to protect her, even if it came 27 years too late." As the cameras stopped rolling, nobody in the studio moved for several minutes. They all understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Not just a man finally telling his truth, but potentially the key to solving one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. Within hours of the interview's broadcast, the world would erupt in response to Burke Ramsey's revelations. Law enforcement agencies would scramble to respond to his accusations. The media would be forced to confront their own role in perpetuating false narratives. And somewhere, Michael Patterson would realize that his 27 years of freedom were about to come to an end. But that night, as Burke finally returned home to his wife and daughter, he felt something he hadn't experienced in nearly 3 decades: peace. He had finally told JonBenét's story, and now the world would have to listen. The first social media post appeared just 16 minutes after Burke Ramsey's interview began airing. Within an hour, hashtags related to the case were trending worldwide. By the end of the 4-hour broadcast, the internet had exploded with reactions ranging from shock and outrage to skepticism and conspiracy theories. The interview had aired simultaneously on 3 major networks, reaching an estimated audience of 127 million viewers in the United States alone. International broadcasts and streaming platforms pushed the global viewership to over 300 million people, making it one of the most-watched television events in history. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a media studies professor at Columbia University, was among the first experts to appear on post-interview analysis shows. "This isn't just about solving a murder case," she explained to a panel of stunned journalists. Burke Ramsey has essentially accused law enforcement and the media of a conspiracy that destroyed his family while allowing a killer to go free. If his allegations are proven true, this will be one of the biggest scandals in American criminal justice history. The immediate response from law enforcement was swift and defensive. Boulder Police Department issued a statement within 2 hours of the broadcast, categorically denying Burke's accusations and defending their investigation. However, their statement was notably brief and failed to address most of the specific evidence Burke had presented. The Boulder Police Department conducted a thorough and professional investigation into the tragic death of JonBenét Ramsey, the statement read. "We stand by our investigative work and reject any allegations of corruption or misconduct. We will review any new evidence that is brought to our attention through proper legal channels." But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. Current Boulder Police Chief Maria Santos called an emergency meeting of senior staff at midnight, long after the interview had ended. According to sources within the department who would later speak anonymously to reporters, Santos was furious that no one had warned her about the potential bombshells Burke might drop. "She wanted to know how the hell we had a detective taking bribes for 27 years without anyone noticing," one source revealed. She was especially upset that Morrison's early retirement and sudden wealth had never been investigated. The FBI's response was more measured but equally significant. Director Robert Hayes announced that the Bureau would be opening a new investigation into JonBenét's murder, with a focus on the allegations Burke had made about police corruption. A task force of 12 agents was assembled within 48 hours, led by Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had made her reputation investigating cold cases and police misconduct. "The allegations made by Mr. Ramsey are serious and specific," Director Hayes said in a press conference. "While we cannot comment on the specifics of our investigation, I can assure the public that we will follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of who might be implicated." The media's response was perhaps the most complex and fascinating aspect of the aftermath. Many outlets that had spent decades speculating about the Ramsey family's guilt were forced to confront their own role in perpetuating false narratives. Some embraced this moment of self-reflection, while others doubled down on their previous coverage. CNN's Anderson Cooper dedicated an entire show to examining how the media had covered the case over the years. "We need to ask ourselves some hard questions," Cooper said during his opening monologue. "Did our appetite for ratings and sensational stories blind us to the truth? Did we participate in the destruction of an innocent family while the real killer remained free?" But not everyone was ready to accept Burke's version of events. Several prominent true crime podcasters and amateur investigators who had built their reputations on theories implicating the Ramsey family pushed back hard against Burke's revelations. Marcus Webb, host of the popular Truth Seekers podcast, released an emergency episode just hours after the interview aired. "This is exactly what you'd expect from someone who's had 27 years to perfect his story," Webb argued. "Burke Ramsey has given us a convenient scapegoat in Michael Patterson and thrown in some police corruption to explain away all the evidence that pointed to his family. It's too neat, too convenient." Webb and others like him faced immediate backlash from their own audiences. Social media was flooded with angry messages from people who felt betrayed by commentators who had spent years promoting theories that now seemed cruel and unfounded. Several podcasters and YouTube channels lost thousands of subscribers overnight, while others issued public apologies for their previous coverage. The reaction was equally intense in law enforcement circles around the country. Police departments that had been following the case for training purposes suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about conducting child murder investigations. The idea that a detective could successfully derail an investigation while taking bribes from the actual perpetrator sent shockwaves through the criminal justice community. Detective Sarah Mitchell of the Miami Police Department had used the Ramsey case as a teaching tool for 15 years, always pointing to it as an example of what happens when investigators become too focused on the immediate family. I'm going to have to completely rewrite my training curriculum, she admitted to colleagues. If Burke is telling the truth, then this case becomes a lesson about corruption and tunnel vision, not about family dynamics. International reaction was equally intense. British criminologist Dr. James Whitfield had written 3 books about the Ramsey case, all of which concluded that someone in the family was responsible for JonBenét's death. Within 24 hours of Burke's interview, Whitfield announced he was withdrawing his books from publication and would be donating the profits to child safety organizations. I was wrong, Whitfield said in a statement that was shared thousands of times on social media. I built my theories on incomplete information and police reports that, if Mr. Ramsey is correct, were deliberately falsified. I owe the Ramsey family an apology, and I owe the public better research. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from someone whose response hadn't been anticipated. Linda Morrison, the ex-wife of Detective James Morrison. She had divorced him in 2003, citing his gambling problems and what she described as personality changes that began around 1997. After watching Burke's interview, Linda called a local news station and asked to speak with a reporter. I always knew something was wrong, Linda told Channel 7's investigative team. Jim came home from work different after the Ramsey case started. He was paranoid, checking the locks constantly, and he suddenly had money he couldn't explain. When I asked about it, he'd get angry and tell me it was none of my business. Linda revealed that she had found large cash deposits in their joint bank account during 1997 and 1998, always in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements. When she questioned her husband about the money, he claimed it was from overtime pay and consulting work, but the amounts never matched his reported income. The worst part was how he talked about the Ramsey family, Linda continued. He seemed almost gleeful about their suffering. He would watch the news coverage and make cruel comments about the parents. It wasn't professional. It was personal, like he enjoyed seeing them in pain. Linda also revealed that her ex-husband had kept extensive files on the Ramsey case at home, far beyond what would be normal for a detective's work materials. After their divorce, she had found boxes of photographs, documents, and notes hidden in their basement. She had assumed they were legitimate police materials and had eventually thrown them away. But now she wondered if they contained evidence that Morrison had suppressed. The revelation that Morrison's own ex-wife supported Burke's accusations added credibility to his story and put additional pressure on law enforcement to act quickly. Within 48 hours of Linda Morrison's interview, federal agents were at her door, with search warrants and questions about what she remembered from those hidden files. Meanwhile, Michael Patterson had seemingly vanished. The address Burke had provided for him led to an empty apartment in Denver. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in several days, and his car was missing from its usual parking spot. A nationwide manhunt was launched, with Patterson's photograph appearing on every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. The search for Patterson revealed disturbing new information about his background. Federal investigators discovered that his real name was Michael Patrick Stevens, and he had been using false identities for years. He had arrest records in 7 states under various names, all involving crimes against children or property crimes, targeting families with young children. Most shocking of all, investigators found evidence linking Patterson to at least 3 other unsolved child disappearance cases in Colorado and neighboring states. In each case, the families had used security services that Patterson had either worked for or had connections to. The realization that JonBenét's murder might be part of a larger pattern of crimes sent new shockwaves through law enforcement. Public reaction to these developments was intense and emotional. Vigils were held in cities across the country, both for JonBenét and for the Ramsey family. At the original site of JonBenét's grave in Atlanta, thousands of people left flowers, cards, and letters of apology to the family. Many of the messages expressed guilt for having believed the family was involved in the murder. John Ramsey, Burke's father, issued his first public statement since the interview through the family's lawyer. Our family is grateful that Burke found the courage to speak the truth after so many years of silence, the statement read. We hope that JonBenét can finally rest in peace, and we pray that no other family will have to endure what we have experienced. The statement also announced that the Ramsey family would be establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting families of murdered children and reforming how law enforcement handles high-profile cases involving families as suspects. But not everyone was ready to accept Burke's story. A group of former investigators and true crime experts formed what they called the Truth and Evidence Coalition, dedicated to challenging Burke's version of events. Led by retired FBI profiler Dr. Marcus Stone, who had worked on the original investigation, the group argued that Burke's accusations were an elaborate attempt to deflect attention from his own potential involvement.
Mr.
Ramsey has had 27 years to construct this narrative, Dr. Stone said in a press conference held outside the Boulder courthouse. He's taken real people with documented problems, like Detective Morrison's gambling issues, and woven them into a conspiracy theory that conveniently explains away all the evidence that pointed to his family. The Truth and Evidence Coalition's challenge to Burke's story created a new controversy within the larger controversy. Their press conference was disrupted by protesters who accused them of perpetuating the harassment of an innocent family. The confrontation was broadcast live on several networks, showing the deep divisions that Burke's revelations had created in public opinion. Social media platforms struggled to manage the flood of content related to the case. Conspiracy theories multiplied rapidly, with some supporting Burke's version of events and others claiming his interview was part of an even larger cover-up. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube all implemented special moderation protocols to prevent the spread of potentially defamatory content while trying to balance free speech concerns. The hashtag #JusticeForJonBenét became one of the most used hashtags in social media history, with over 50 million posts in the first week after Burke's interview. The hashtag was used both by people supporting Burke's allegations and by those questioning his credibility, creating a chaotic online environment where fact and speculation blended together. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies across the country were quietly reviewing their own cold cases to see if any might be connected to Michael Patterson. The FBI had created a task force specifically to coordinate this effort, led by Agent Walsh's team. Within a week, they had identified over 40 unsolved cases that showed similarities to the patterns Burke had described. The media attention was so intense that several news organizations assigned teams of reporters exclusively to cover developments in the case. The Denver Post created a special section on their website dedicated to JonBenét coverage, updated hourly with new developments. Cable news networks were running near-continuous coverage, with panels of experts debating every aspect of Burke's claims. The international media was equally fascinated. British tabloids ran daily front-page stories about the case, with headlines like Brothers Bombshell and Ramsey Revenge. Japanese television networks sent crews to Boulder to cover the story, and European newspapers published lengthy analyses of how the case had captivated American culture for nearly 3 decades. But amid all the media chaos and public debate, the most important developments were happening quietly in law enforcement offices and courtrooms. Federal investigators were methodically working through the evidence Burke had provided, while prosecutors were preparing potential charges against both Patterson and Morrison. The world had erupted in response to Burke Ramsey's revelations. But the most crucial reactions were yet to come. Law enforcement was closing in on their targets, and the truth about what happened on that terrible Christmas night in 1996 was finally about to be revealed. Michael Patterson was found in a remote cabin in the mountains of Wyoming, 3 weeks after Burke Ramsey's explosive interview. The FBI task force, led by Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, had been tracking him through a network of old contacts and false identities. What they discovered when they finally cornered him would validate Burke's accusations in the most dramatic way possible. The cabin belonged to Patterson's brother, a recluse who claimed he hadn't seen Michael in years. But federal agents had been monitoring the property through satellite surveillance for 5 days when they noticed smoke coming from the chimney and movement inside. A tactical team surrounded the cabin at dawn on March 8, 2024. Agent Walsh later described the arrest in testimony before a congressional committee investigating the case. "We expected resistance, possibly violence," she said. "What we found instead was a broken man who seemed almost relieved that his decades of running were finally over." Patterson didn't resist arrest. According to the FBI report, he simply sat at the kitchen table and said, "I've been waiting for this day since 1996. The cabin was filled with newspaper clippings about the Ramsey case, printed internet articles, and what appeared to be a journal documenting Patterson's growing paranoia over the years. But the most damning evidence was found in a hidden compartment under the cabin's floorboards. Patterson had kept a collection of items from JonBenét's murder that had never been reported missing, including a piece of her jewelry and photographs that could only have been taken by someone present at the crime scene. He had created a shrine to his crime, Agent Walsh explained. There were photos of JonBenét taken during the assault, items from the Ramsey house, and detailed maps of the neighborhood showing escape routes. It was the collection of a man who was proud of what he had done and couldn't let go of it. Even more shocking was a handwritten confession Patterson had apparently been working on for years. The document, over 40 pages long, provided a detailed account of how he had planned and carried out JonBenét's murder, as well as his arrangement with Detective Morrison to cover up his involvement. According to Patterson's confession, the crime had indeed started as a kidnapping attempt that went wrong. He had been watching the Ramsey family for weeks, learning their routines and planning what he thought would be a simple ransom scheme. Wealthy families like the Ramseys, he believed, would pay whatever it took to get their child back safely. "I never meant to kill her," Patterson had written. "But she fought harder than I expected, and she was screaming so loud I was afraid the whole neighborhood would wake up. I hit her to make her stop, and I hit her too hard." The confession revealed that after killing JonBenét, Patterson had panicked and called Detective Morrison, with whom he had been working on other illegal schemes. Morrison had rushed to the Ramsey house and helped Patterson stage the scene to make it look like an inside job. "Morrison told me the police would automatically suspect the family if we made it look right," the confession continued. "He said wealthy families always looked guilty in these situations, and the media would do the rest of our work for us." The document detailed how Morrison had helped Patterson write the ransom note, deliberately making it bizarre and overly dramatic to fuel speculation about the family's involvement. Morrison had also planted evidence and suppressed witness statements that might have led investigators to Patterson. Patterson's confession corroborated every major claim Burke had made during his interview, but it also revealed additional crimes. He admitted to molesting and murdering 2 other children in Colorado between 1994 and 1994, crimes that had remained unsolved. He also detailed a network of corrupt law enforcement officers who had been taking bribes to ignore certain crimes or misdirect investigations. The arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Within 24 hours, 3 other police officers, mentioned in Patterson's confession, had been arrested on federal corruption charges. Detective Morrison, who had been in hiding since Burke's interview aired, turned himself in to federal authorities through his lawyer. Morrison's surrender came with its own bombshell revelation. His attorney announced that Morrison would be cooperating fully with federal investigators and would testify against other officers involved in the corruption network. In exchange for his cooperation, Morrison would plead guilty to obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges rather than facing potential murder charges as an accessory after the fact. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. Federal investigators discovered that Morrison had been part of a network of officers across multiple jurisdictions who were taking bribes to protect criminals involved in child exploitation. The network had operated for over a decade, with Patterson being just one of several dangerous criminals who had bought their freedom through police corruption. Burke Ramsey's vindication was complete, but the cost had been enormous. Press conferences were held by law enforcement agencies across Colorado as they announced reviews of dozens of cases that might have been compromised by the corruption network. Families who had lost children to unsolved murders suddenly had new hope that their cases might finally see justice. The media response to Patterson's capture and confession was swift and intense. Many outlets that had spent years promoting theories about Ramsey family involvement issued formal apologies and retractions. The New York Times published a lengthy editorial examining how legitimate news organizations had been manipulated into perpetuating false narratives. "We must confront the uncomfortable truth that our pursuit of ratings and reader engagement made us willing participants in the destruction of an innocent family," the Times editorial board wrote. "The Ramsey family deserves not just our apologies, but our commitment to better investigative standards and more responsible reporting of criminal cases." But the most powerful media response came from Sarah Chen, the journalist who had conducted Burke's interview. She announced that she would be producing a documentary series examining how media coverage of high-profile crimes can become part of the crime itself. Burke Ramsey didn't just solve his sister's murder. Chen said in a statement. He exposed how law enforcement corruption and media sensationalism can work together to destroy innocent lives while allowing guilty ones to escape justice. This story isn't just about one family suffering. It's about fundamental problems in our criminal justice system and our media culture. The legal proceedings that followed would become some of the most closely watched in American history. Patterson was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault in JonBenét's death, as well as similar charges in connection with the other murders he had confessed to. Legal experts predicted that he would face the death penalty in multiple jurisdictions. Morrison and the other corrupt officers faced federal charges including racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The federal prosecutor handling the case, District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, announced that her office would seek the maximum penalties allowed under law. These defendants didn't just commit crimes, Martinez said in a press conference. They perverted the entire criminal justice system and allowed dangerous predators to operate freely while innocent families suffered. The betrayal of public trust in this case is almost unprecedented. The civil lawsuits that followed were equally significant. The Ramsey family filed federal civil rights lawsuits against the Boulder Police Department, several media organizations, and the individual officers involved in the corruption. The lawsuits sought hundreds of millions of dollars in damages for what their attorneys described as a systematic campaign of harassment and defamation that destroyed a family while protecting a killer. Burke's attorney, David Rodriguez, announced that any financial settlements would be used to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by police misconduct and media malpractice in criminal cases. This isn't about money for the Ramsey family, Rodriguez explained. It's about ensuring that no other family has to endure what they've experienced. The psychological impact on Burke and his family was complex. While vindication brought relief, it also brought a new kind of trauma. Burke had spent 27 years believing that he was somehow responsible for not preventing his sister's murder. Learning that his family had been deliberately framed as part of a criminal conspiracy added new layers of anger and grief. Burke entered intensive therapy with Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating survivors of violent crimes. Burke is dealing with what we call complicated grief, Dr. Foster explained to reporters with Burke's permission. He's grieving not just for his sister, but for the childhood he lost, the normal life his family never had, and the 27 years they spent under false suspicion. Miranda and Emma Ramsey also needed professional support to deal with the dramatic changes in their lives. The family had gone from living in relative anonymity to being the center of the biggest criminal justice story in decades. Death threats from Patterson's supporters and conspiracy theorists who refused to accept his guilt created new security concerns. The FBI provided protection for the Ramsey family during the initial weeks after Patterson's arrest, but Burke ultimately decided to hire private security. "We've been victims for too long," he said in a statement. "We're not going to let fear control our lives anymore." John Ramsey, Burke's father, emerged from decades of relative seclusion to become an advocate for criminal justice reform. Despite being in his 80s, John began speaking at conferences and working with legislators to strengthen laws against police corruption and to protect families who become suspects in high-profile cases. "What happened to our family was a perfect storm of corruption, incompetence, and media irresponsibility," John said in testimony before a congressional committee examining the case. "But it doesn't have to happen to other families if we're willing to learn from our experience and make the necessary changes." The case also prompted a broader examination of how child murder cases are investigated. Police departments across the country began reviewing their procedures for handling cases involving family members as suspects. The International Association of Chiefs of Police issued new guidelines emphasizing the importance of considering all possible suspects and maintaining investigative objectivity, even under intense media pressure. Dr. Robert Chen, David Chen's brother, and a criminology professor at UC Berkeley, published a comprehensive study of the Ramsey case that became required reading in criminal justice programs nationwide. This case demonstrates how tunnel vision in criminal investigations can be deliberately created and exploited by bad actors, Chen wrote. "It's a cautionary tale that every law enforcement officer and prosecutor should study." But perhaps the most significant impact was on the broader true crime community. Burke's revelations forced a reckoning with how amateur investigators and content creators approach unsolved cases. Many podcasters and YouTubers who had built audiences by speculating about family involvement issued public apologies and committed to higher ethical standards. Marcus Webb, the podcaster who had initially challenged Burke's story, became one of the most vocal advocates for reform in true crime content. "I realized that I had become part of the problem," Webb admitted in a special episode of his podcast. "I was so invested in my theories that I lost sight of the fact that I was talking about real people's lives, not just an entertaining mystery." The amateur investigation community split into two camps: those who embraced higher ethical standards and those who continued to promote conspiracy theories despite overwhelming evidence. Several online forums dedicated to the Ramsey case shut down permanently, while others implemented strict moderation policies to prevent harassment of the family. As the legal proceedings continued and the full scope of the corruption became clear, Burke found himself in an unexpected position, not just as a victim who had been vindicated, but as a catalyst for meaningful reform in how America handles high-profile criminal cases. His decision to break decades of silence had exposed not just his sister's killer, but a web of corruption and media malpractice that had affected countless other families. The hunt for Patterson had ended with his capture, but the reckoning he and Burke's courage had triggered was just beginning. The American criminal justice system was being forced to confront its deepest flaws, and the media was grappling with its role in perpetuating injustice. For Burke Ramsey, the little boy who had been forced to grow up under suspicion, it was finally time to help others avoid the same fate. The courthouse in Denver was surrounded by media from around the world. On the morning of October 15, 2024, as Michael Patterson was scheduled to be sentenced for the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, 9 months had passed since Burke's explosive interview, and the legal proceedings had captivated the nation as evidence mounted against not just Patterson, but the entire network of corruption that had protected him for nearly 3 decades. Burke Ramsey sat in the front row of the courtroom with his father John, his wife Miranda, and their daughter Emma. For the first time in 27 years, the Ramsey family was in a courtroom not as suspects, but as the victims they had always been. Burke wore a simple black suit and carried a photo of JonBenét that had been taken just days before her death. Not one of the pageant photos that had dominated media coverage, but a candid shot of her laughing on Christmas morning. Patterson had pled guilty to all charges 3 months earlier, sparing the Ramsey family the trauma of a trial, but ensuring that he would face the maximum possible sentence. His confession had been corroborated by physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own detailed journal entries. There was no doubt about his guilt, but the sentencing hearing would provide the first opportunity for Burke to address his sister's killer directly. Judge Margaret Sullivan had presided over some of Colorado's most high-profile cases, but she later said that the Ramsey sentencing was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, victims' advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case for decades. This case has had an impact far beyond the tragic loss of one little girl, Judge Sullivan said as she opened the proceedings. It has exposed fundamental flaws in our criminal justice system and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we investigate crimes and how we treat victims' families. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, presented a comprehensive overview of Patterson's crimes. Beyond JonBenét's murder, he had confessed to killing 3 other children and sexually assaulting dozens more over a 20-year period. The scope of his crimes had only become clear after his arrest, as investigators across multiple states compared notes and DNA evidence. Michael Patterson is a predator who robbed families of their children and robbed communities of their sense of safety, Martinez told the court. But his crimes were enabled by a network of corrupt law enforcement officers who took money to look the other way while children died. The defendant's actions destroyed not just his victims, but countless other lives that were touched by his evil. Patterson's defense attorney, court-appointed counsel James Mitchell, had argued for a sentence of life in prison without parole, rather than the death penalty. Mitchell acknowledged his client's guilt but asked the court to consider Patterson's own traumatic childhood and mental health issues. Nothing can excuse what Mr. History Patterson did, Mitchell said, but executing him will not bring back the children he killed or heal the families he destroyed. Life in prison ensures that he will never hurt another child, while allowing the families to move forward without years of additional legal proceedings. The victim impact statements were the most emotional part of the hearing. Burke had prepared his remarks for weeks, working with Dr. Foster to find the words that would honor his sister's memory while expressing the full scope of his family's suffering. When Burke's name was called, he walked slowly to the podium, placing JonBenét's photo where both Patterson and Judge Sullivan could see it. For a moment, he simply looked at the man who had destroyed his family's life, studying Patterson's face as if trying to understand how such evil could exist. "My name is Burke Ramsey," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I was 9 years old when you murdered my 6-year-old sister JonBenét on December 26, 1996. I am now 36 years old, which means I have lived more of my life with the knowledge of what you did than without it." Burke spoke for 20 minutes, describing not just the immediate impact of his sister's murder, but the decades of suspicion, harassment, and trauma that followed. He talked about his mother's slow death from cancer, hastened by the stress of being falsely accused. He described his father's struggle to maintain his dignity while being vilified in the media. And he spoke about his own journey from a scared little boy to a man determined to find the truth. "You didn't just kill my sister," Burke said, looking directly at Patterson. "You killed our family's ability to grieve normally. You robbed us of the chance to remember JonBenét with pure love instead of painful questions. You turned our tragedy into entertainment for millions of people while you lived freely for 27 years. But Burke's most powerful words came when he talked about forgiveness and moving forward. "I don't forgive you," he said simply. "I don't think forgiveness is something you can earn or that I owe you, but I refuse to let you continue to control my life or my family's life. Today, your power over us ends forever." John Ramsey spoke next, his voice shaking with age and emotion as he described watching his wife die under the weight of false accusations. "Patsy never lived to see this day," he said. "She never got to hear you confess or see our family vindicated. But I know she would want me to tell you that while we will never forgive you for what you did, we are grateful that you can never hurt another child." Other family members whose children had been killed by Patterson also spoke. Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter Carmen had disappeared in 1998, sobbed as she described 25 years of not knowing what had happened to her child. "At least the Ramseys found JonBenét's body," she said. "I never even got to bury my daughter properly, because you wouldn't tell us where you put her." Patterson himself was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. His attorney had advised him to remain silent, but Patterson insisted on addressing the court. When he stood, his hands shaking and his voice barely audible, he looked directly at Burke. "I have spent 27 years trying to convince myself that what I did wasn't as bad as it was," Patterson said. "I told myself that your family was rich and would get over it. I told myself that the other families wouldn't miss their children as much because they weren't as perfect as JonBenét. I know now that I was lying to myself." Patterson's statement lasted only a few minutes, but it was significant because it contained no excuses or justifications. He acknowledged that his crimes had been motivated by his own evil impulses, not by mental illness or childhood trauma. He also confirmed details of his confession that defense attorneys had hoped to challenge. "I deserve to die for what I did," Patterson concluded. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't mean anything after all these years, but I am sorry. And I hope that my death will finally give these families some peace." Judge Sullivan recessed the court for 30 minutes before returning to deliver Patterson's sentence. When she returned, her voice was firm and clear as she addressed Patterson directly. "Mr. Patterson, in 40 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that combined such horrific crimes with such a complete betrayal of justice," she began. "You didn't just murder children. You corrupted law enforcement officers, manipulated the media, and turned the criminal justice system into an instrument of additional torture for your victims' families." The judge sentenced Patterson to death for JonBenét's murder, with additional life sentences for his other crimes. She also recommended that he be held in solitary confinement for his own protection, noting that child killers were often targeted by other inmates. "Your crimes were so heinous that they defy comprehension," Judge Sullivan continued. "But equally disturbing was your ability to manipulate corrupt law enforcement officers to help you escape justice. You turned the very system that should have protected children into a weapon against innocent families." The sentences for the corrupt police officers came in separate hearings over the following weeks. Detective Morrison received a 20-year federal sentence for conspiracy and civil rights violations. 3 other officers received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. All were also ordered to pay restitution to the families whose cases they had compromised. Morrison's sentencing hearing was particularly emotional because several families whose children had been murdered while he was taking bribes confronted him directly. Unlike Patterson, Morrison attempted to justify his actions, claiming that he had been threatened and coerced. His explanations were met with angry shouts from the gallery and a sharp rebuke from the federal judge. The civil lawsuits filed by the Ramsey family were settled for undisclosed amounts that were reported to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The Boulder Police Department, several media companies, and individual officers all paid settlements rather than face trials that would have generated additional negative publicity. Burke announced that the settlement money would be used to establish the JonBenét Ramsey Foundation for Justice Reform, dedicated to supporting families affected by wrongful accusations and police misconduct. The foundation would also fund research into improving criminal investigations and media coverage of high-profile cases. JonBenét's legacy shouldn't be that she was a victim, Burke said at the foundation's launch event. Her legacy should be that her death led to changes that protect other families from experiencing what we went through. The foundation's first major initiative was lobbying for federal legislation that would provide independent oversight of police investigations in cases involving family members as suspects. The proposed law, dubbed JonBenét's Law, would require federal review when local investigations focus exclusively on family members for more than 6 months without making arrests. Congressional hearings on the legislation featured testimony from Burke, other wrongfully accused family members, and law enforcement experts. The bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law by the president in a ceremony attended by the Ramsey family. No family should have to endure what the Ramseys experienced, the president said during the signing ceremony. This law won't bring back JonBenét or undo the suffering her family endured, but it will help ensure that future investigations focus on finding the truth rather than confirming preconceived theories. The media reforms that followed were equally significant. Several major news organizations adopted new ethical guidelines for covering cases involving family members as suspects. The guidelines required multiple sources for any story suggesting family involvement and prohibited speculation presented as fact. Sarah Chen, the journalist who had conducted Burke's explosive interview, became one of the leading advocates for responsible crime reporting. She testified before the Federal Communications Commission about the need for broadcast standards that protect innocent family members while still allowing legitimate investigative journalism. The Ramsey case taught us that the media can become an unwitting accomplice to injustice when we prioritize ratings over responsibility, Chen told the FCC panel. We have an obligation to report the truth, not to participate in the destruction of innocent lives. The true crime community also underwent significant changes. Several popular podcasts and YouTube channels implemented new ethical standards, including requirements for disclosure when discussing living individuals and prohibitions on monetizing content that promotes unproven theories about specific people. Marcus Webb, the podcaster who had initially challenged Burke's story, became one of the most vocal advocates for reform. He used his platform to educate other content creators about the impact of irresponsible speculation on real families. We forgot that the people we were talking about aren't characters in a story, Webb said in a widely shared video essay. They're real human beings whose lives we were affecting with our theories and speculation. The Ramsey family taught us that we have to do better. For Burke personally, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The weight of carrying his sister's unsolved murder for 27 years had lifted, but it was replaced by new responsibilities as an advocate for justice reform. Burke returned to work as a technology consultant, but he also began speaking at law enforcement conferences and university criminal justice programs. His presentations focused on how wrongful accusations affect families and how investigators can avoid the tunnel vision that had characterized his sister's case. I'm not an expert on law enforcement, Burke would typically begin his presentations, but I am an expert on what it feels like to be wrongfully suspected of murder for 27 years. I can tell you exactly what that does to a family, and I can help you understand why getting the investigation right the first time is so important. Burke's marriage to Miranda grew stronger through the ordeal, and their daughter Emma showed remarkable resilience despite the media attention surrounding their family. Burke was careful to protect Emma from the details of the case while ensuring that she understood her aunt's legacy and the importance of the changes her family's suffering had helped bring about. John Ramsey, despite his advanced age, became an energetic advocate for criminal justice reform. He testified before numerous legislative committees and worked with victims' rights organizations to support other families facing similar situations. His transformation from a private businessman to a public advocate surprised many who had known him during the years when the family maintained their silence. The first anniversary of Burke's interview was marked by a memorial service for JonBenét at the Boulder church where her funeral had been held 27 years earlier. This time, however, the service was a celebration of her life and her legacy, rather than a gathering marked by suspicion and unanswered questions. Burke delivered the eulogy, speaking not as the brother of a murder victim, but as a man whose sister's death had ultimately led to meaningful changes in how society handles such tragedies. JonBenét was 6 years old when she died, Burke said to the packed church. She never got to grow up, never got to have children of her own, never got to see the world beyond Boulder. But in her death, she became the catalyst for changes that will protect countless other children and families. That's the legacy I choose to remember. After the service, Burke visited JonBenét's grave for the first time in many years. He placed fresh flowers at the headstone and spoke to her quietly, telling her about Emma and Miranda, about the foundation that bore her name, and about the changes her death had brought about. "I kept my promise, JonBenét," he whispered. "I found the man who hurt you, and I made sure he could never hurt anyone else. I hope you can rest peacefully now." As Burke walked away from the cemetery with his family, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible Christmas morning in 1996, genuine peace. His sister's killer was on death row. The corrupt officers who had protected him were in prison, and the system that had failed JonBenét had been reformed to better protect other families. Most importantly, Burke was no longer the 9-year-old boy who had been too scared to speak up about what he had seen that night. He was a man who had found the courage to tell the truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. And in finding that courage, he had not only solved his sister's murder, but had helped create a world where other families might be spared the suffering his own had endured. JonBenét Ramsey's case was finally closed, but her legacy and her brother's courage in seeking justice would live on in the reforms and protections that grew from their family's long struggle for truth. After nearly 3 decades of silence, Burke had spoken, and the world had listened. Justice, delayed though it was, had finally been served.